The Arab Oil Embargo from 1973 to 1974. Energy, power, and global economic transformation. Content. One of the most important economic shocks in modern history. Oil used as a geopolitical weapon, changed global power structures, led to inflation, recession, and policy transformation. The Arab Oil Embargo of 1973-1974 represents a critical turning point in the relationship between natural resources and global political power. Prior to this event, oil was primarily treated as an industrial commodity necessary for transportation, manufacturing, electricity generation, and military logistics. However, the embargo demonstrated that control over energy resources could be transformed into a strategic instrument capable of influencing international policy decisions, altering economic trajectories across entire continents. The embargo occurred in the context of the Yom Kippur War, when several Arab members of OPEC imposed restrictions on oil exports to countries perceived as supporting Israel, particularly the United States and the Netherlands. This deliberate restriction of supply created shortages that disrupted industrial production and increased transportation costs, triggered inflationary pressure, and forced governments to reconsider their dependence on imported energy resources. The long-term implications of embargo extended far beyond temporary shortages. Governments created strategic petroleum reserves, industries redesigned technologies to improve energy efficiency, and economic policy framework shifted toward prioritizing inflation control. The event demonstrated that economic systems are deeply dependent on physical resources and that geopolitical tensions can significantly influence global supply chains. Slide 2. Historical background. Historical context before the embargo. Oil demand increased rapidly after World War II. Industrial economies became dependent on imported oil. Middle East controlled large reserves of petroleum. OPEC formed in 1960 to coordinate oil policies. Following the Second World War, industrial economies experienced rapid expansion driven by manufacturing growth, automobile adoption, suburban development, and increased military activity during the Cold War. Oil became the primary energy source powering transportation networks, industrial machinery, electricity generation, and chemical industries. During this period, major oil companies maintained significant control over extraction and pricing structures. However, oil producing countries increasingly recognized that they possessed valuable resources that could provide substantial economic leverage if managed strategically. The formation of Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries in 1960 marked the beginning of collective efforts among producers to influence pricing and supply decisions. By the early 1970s, industrial nations such as the United States, Western economic nations, and Japan had become structurally dependent on imported petroleum. This dependency created a strategic vulnerability that became apparent when supply disruptions occurred. Slide 3. The Yom Kippur War Trigger. Geopolitical Trigger. The Yom Kippur War of 1973. Slide content. War between Israel and Arab states. Egypt and Syria launched surprise attacks. Western nations supported Israel. Arab oil producers responded with an embargo. The immediate trigger for the oil embargo was the Yom Kippur War of October 1973. Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated military offensive against Israel in an attempt to regain territories lost during the Six Days War of 1967. The conflict quickly escalated into a major geopolitical confrontation involving global powers. The United States provided military and logistical support to Israel, reinforcing the perception among oil nations that Western countries were politically aligned against their strategic interests. In response, Arab oil producing countries implemented a coordinated embargo targeting nations perceived as supporting Israel. The decision to restrict oil supply was not merely symbolic. It represented a calculated strategy to impose economic costs on opposing countries and alter diplomatic behavior through resource control. Slide 4. Production cuts and supply reduction. Oil production cuts. Slide content. Arab producers reduced oil production by about 25%. Supply reductions targeted specific countries. The United States and Netherlands were heavily affected. Global oil supply significantly reduced. Arab oil ministers announced a reduction in oil production of approximately 25% compared to previous output levels. According to intelligence estimates presented in the current state of the Arab oil embargo, Production reductions amounted to nearly 1.95 million barrels per day by mid-November 1973. These reductions created supply shortages in major industrial economies. The United States faced potential deficits of approximately 2.5 million barrels per day during winter months. Western Europe and Japan also experienced supply constraints due to heavy reliance on imported petroleum. Supply restrictions didn't immediately cause shortages due to existing stockpiles. However, as reserves declined, shortages became more visible through rising fuel prices, reduced industrial output, and consumer restrictions. Slide 5. Economic impact. Global economic shock. Content. Oil prices increased sharply, transportation costs increased, inflation increased worldwide, economic costs slowed. The oil embargo caused a rapid increase in the global oil prices, which transmitted cost pressure across multiple sectors of economy. Transportation became more expensive because fuel costs increased. Manufacturing costs rose due to increased energy expenses. Agricultural production became more expensive due to reliance on fuel powered machinery and fertilizer production. The combination of high inflation and slow economic growth created a phenomenon known as stagflation. Traditional economic policies were not well equipped to address simultaneous inflation and stagnation, leading policymakers to reconsider macroeconomic strategies. The oil shock demonstrated how supply disruptions in critical commodities can generate widespread economic instability. Slide 6. Impact on the United States. United States energy crisis. Content. Oil shortages occurred, fuel prices increased significantly, gasoline rationing implemented, economic slowdown observed. The United States experienced fuel shortages resulting in long lines at gasoline stations. Consumers faced rationing policies limiting fuel purchases. Business faced increased transportation and production costs, reducing profitability and investment activity. Industrial output slowed as energy became more expensive. Inflation increased significantly due to rising costs across supply chains. Policymakers began to consider long term strategies to reduce dependence on imported oil. Slide 7. Impact on Western Europe and Japan. Global impact beyond the United States. Content. Western Europe faced supply deficits. Japan, highly dependent on imported oil and industrial production, affected diplomatic relations, influenced energy access. Western European countries faced significant supply deficits due to heavy reliance on imported oil. Some countries attempted diplomatic engagement with Arab producers in order to secure favorable treatment. Japan faced even greater vulnerability due to near total dependence on imported petroleum. Supply disruptions faced governments to reconsider Supply disruptions forced governments to reconsider foreign policy positions and energy strategies. Diplomatic relationships increasingly influenced access to energy resources. Slide 8. Government responses. Policy responses to the crisis. Strategic petroleum reserves created. Energy conservation policies implemented. Investment in alternative energy increased. Government introduced fuel efficiency standards. Government responded to the oil crisis by implementing fuel policies aimed at reducing vulnerability to future supply disruptions. Strategic petroleum reserves were created to store emergency oil supplies. Energy conservation policies encouraged reduced fuel consumption. Investment increased in alternative energy resources such as nuclear energy, coal, and later renewable technologies, including solar and wind power. Fuel efficiency standards were introduced by automobiles and industrial equipment manufacturers. These policy changes represented structural adjustments in response to energy security. Slide 9. Long-term effects. Long-term structural changes. Content. Energy security became national priority. Oil markets became more politically sensitive. Diversification of energy sources increased. Global economic policies evolved. The long-term effects of the oil embargo extended beyond immediate economic disruptions. Energy security became a central component of national policy. Government recognized that dependence on concentrated resource suppliers could be strategic vulnerabilities. Oil markets became more sensitive to geopolitical tensions. Financial markets began to incorporate energy price volatility into risk calculations. The global economy gradually diversified towards multiple energy sources in order to reduce systematic risk. The embargo demonstrated that control over critical resources can influence global political and economic stability. Slide 10. Conclusion. Energy as strategic power. Oil become a geopolitical weapon. Resource control influence global politics. Economic systems depend on energy stability. Lessons remain even relevant today. Remain relevant today. The oil embargo demonstrated that control over natural resources can generate strategic leverage capable of influencing international relations and economic structures. Energy security remains a critical component of national security planning. Modern geopolitical competition continues to evolve control over strategic resources including oil, natural gas, rare earth minerals, and semiconductor supply chains. The lesson from the 1973 oil crisis remain relevant for understanding how economic systems respond to supply disruptions. The embargo illustrates how the embargo illustrates that economic power is closely linked to resource control and that global stability depends on secure and diversified supply chains. Thank you very much.